It sounds funny to say that we're going to learn from nature. Actually, we're learning from nature right now. You just had a course in pandemics, whether you wanted to take it or not. The title of the course is usually something like epidemiology. But we have a lot to learn from nature. I'll try to show you what I mean. First of all, Montana has 5 million acres of wheat. And we also have as many beef cattle as we have people. And I started getting interested in nutrition, but it's not a subject that you bring up among agriculturists very often. The whole system that we have is based on commodities and yield, and has been controlled by a small number of companies. And the kinds of things we've had to learn are, if you want to break away and improve the economy here, basically you have to give the farmers something else to grow. So when we look at nutrition, the first thing we could look at is wheat. It's loaded with gluten. It's considered a good crop. I gave this lecture 20, 30 years ago to the U.S. Wheat Associates, and 4 people wrote letters to our dean asking for my instant retirement. Fortunately, the dean said, you better listen to the guy a little bit. Consider him flaky if you want, but better listen. So I went to Egypt on a barley project, and they almost never eat wheat they never eat meat in Egypt. It's too expensive. Maybe a few eggs. And we looked at how they ferment the bread, and the bacteria that they ferment the bread with, it's called sourdough bacteria. It produces CO2, acetic acid, and lactic acid. And that drops the pH of the bread so much that it stays fresh, or if you wish, sour. We took the bacterium and mutated it using analog selection and got double the nutrition of the bread just by fermenting it with a bacterium. It didn't matter what yeast you used, or more important, there are 4,000 varieties of wheat. Rather than improve wheat by making it high lysine, it was a lot easier to just one type of bacteria. And we succeeded at that. Then we looked at protein. We're a high protein state. The reason why we can ship grain all the way to Portland and compete with the Oregon growers is that we have lower yield and higher protein. And it costs about $1 a bushel out of a $4 bushel to ship wheat all the way to Portland. Recently, we developed a high lysine wheat. For 30 years, nobody wanted it. 20 years, 30 years. Suddenly, 5 companies want it. So we're growing it in Arizona right now because people will pay for nutrition. We also developed Montina, which was Indian rice grass. I had a student came to the lab. He was a history major. I said, look up what Native Americans used to eat before they had corn. And he found an old paper where there was a cave where the ceiling collapsed 7,000 years ago. And in that cave were some dead bodies. And in the metate where they grind grain was not corn, but Indian rice grass. We'll show you the results of that work, but we released Montina, a gluten-free cereal grain, perennial grass. It grows in Montana very well. Then we developed Proteina, and I promised you guys a bag of Proteina, but the director of the lab out there in Belgrade, the milling company that we've worked with for years, came down with COVID, so I'm afraid to go out there. We developed Timtana because I was a farm boy, and there's a grass called Timothy grass, and when you're lazy and you've maybe worked too hard, you pull a piece of Timothy grass by the head and you suck on the stem, and it's sweet. And it occurred to me, if that's sweet, then maybe the grain is good. And we grew the grain, and it's called Timtana, Timothy. It's very high in protein. Then we worked on camelina, wrinkled peas, low glycemic potatoes, high lysine tomatoes and potatoes, high lysine wheat, producing vaccines in bananas rather than by pharmaceuticals. We needed a 3D printer to print seed. We do all this stuff. I would welcome any of you in this class of 250 to come visit the lab when things clean up a little bit. But we have to look at animals. We worked on baby chickens, and we found that they could taste lysine in 3 days after they hatched. Furthermore, their lysine receptor didn't care whether it was D or L lysine. When we fed them D lysine, they could taste it. They preferred that. But they died after 9 days for lack of lysine. So animals are very aware of nutrition. Humans, well, dogs and nematodes have 730 different taste receptors in their mouth. Nematodes, which don't even have eyes and have to work in the dark their whole life, can move around and tell where nutrition is. Humans only have 100 taste receptors instead of 730. We're omnivores. We can eat meat. So there's some good books here if you want to write them down. Before the Dawn, Pandora's Seed, The Journey of Man. And this is all about how we as humans came out of Africa. But Nicholas Wade, Spencer Wells, Cochrane. And if you want to know about celiac disease, look that up, Wikipedia. So, as it turns out, we were hunter-gatherers in the Paleolithic period, 30,000 to 9,000 years before Christ. And look at the height of men. It was almost 5'10". And then we started agriculture. Early Neolithic, late Neolithic, we lost 6 inches in height. So this whole thing about agriculture being good and shifting from hunting, gathering, to living in civilizations, it maybe hurt our height and our health. And when you move into civilizations, diseases are more easily transmitted as well. So after 5,000 to 7,000 years, we're getting our height back. We're learning about what we need in nutrition. And you haven't seen anything yet. We're really learning. This guy lived on an island named Kos. It was a Greek island, still is. And he was a clinician. So he had a clinic there where people would come from all over Greece and so on. And Greece was bigger then. And he didn't have Pfizer. He didn't have antibiotics. He didn't have drugs. And he said, our food should be our medicine. I think we're getting back to that now, whether we like it or not. In the next lecture, I will talk about our work with plasmid curing, where we're trying to stop MRSA, which is resistant. That's methicillin-resistant bacteria. So let's go to France. You fly over France and it looks like this. The people there are indigenous. They've been there for 40,000 years. They kicked out the Neanderthals. Although we all have some Neanderthal blood in us, maybe 2% or so. And they grow a big diversity of crops, as you can see here. And except for Brittany, which is part of France, almost nobody is overweight. This is Montana. We've only been around, at least the invaders, us, for 150 years. And that's what we do with agriculture, that big field. So the way you learn, at least the way we have learned about nutrition, is to read the medical literature. It tells you about protein, tells you about kwashiorkor if you don't get enough protein in your diet. It tells you about omega-3 for brain formation, which Ed Dratz presented so well. It tells you about the limiting amino acids. Proteins are made of 20, but you only need 4 to 6 amino acids in your diet to really be healthy. And then we translate that into how do you breed crops for nutrition. And we published a paper, The Breeder's Dilemma, yield versus nutrition. They go crosswise. Higher yield, lower nutrition. We'll get into that in a minute. And once you have these new improved crops, how do you get them into a market? That's way beyond science. That's more to do with economics, marketing, and convincing stakeholders like farmers holding pencils that they can do better. So fortunately, we have some new technology. We'll tell you a little about that. This is a chip, and it tells you whether genes are turned on or off in a particular diet. If you run 10 miles a day, what happens to your genes? How many turn on? How many turn off? And there's a company now that you can ask your parents for a Christmas present to get your genes analyzed. What's interesting is it's basically a research project, and over 1 million people have now done 23andMe, and with those data, they can predict genes for heart attacks, genes for all kinds of things. And when you give your sample of saliva to this company, there's 9 pages of questions you have to answer. So it's really a research project, good Christmas present. These are the genes that they have found for breast cancer and all the other things that they have found in 23andMe, including celiac diseases, which I guess I shouldn't eat wheat myself. This is my granddaughter. In her 2nd year, she grew 1 pound. And I had been working on gluten and celiac disease, and I suggested her parents find a doctor that understood. And 3 doctors later, they found that her TTG was 180, which is a measurement. It should be 30. So she had celiac disease, and her brother also had it. We took her off wheat. She can't even eat out of the same pan as most people if there's any wheat in it. And she's perfectly healthy now, as far as I know. She's a cross-country runner entering college. So awareness is everything. If you can find out what's in your genes and what you ought to do about it, you can be healthier. So what is celiac disease? Those are the intestinal villi in your intestine on the left. And on the right, if you have celiac disease, they're really all clumped up, and you have to eat twice as well to get the same nutrition. So in Montana, my 2 grandchildren there, and my daughter, and me, we're all celiac. And so that's this field of oats. Oats don't have gluten. And we have developed oat varieties, one called Proteina. And it's grown in this state. And farmers get 40 cents a pound for it instead of 6 cents a pound for normal oats. So what is gluten? It's a seed storage protein. And the big problem is animals can't make 10 amino acids. Plants can make all 20 that you need. So a plant can store its amino acids or its nitrogen in proteins and get by perfectly well. But gluten is that spongy stuff in wheat that makes wheat rise, which means that wheat absorbs a lot of water, and when you cook it, it rises and makes a nice loaf of bread. Gluten wasn't evolved to provide nutrition for seed. Okay, it was, but not for animals. So gluten is not very digestible. So we started looking at protein. The first thing we found was that student that looked in the cave 7,000 years ago and found Indian rice grass, and we started growing it here. And it's gluten-free. And that's what Indian rice grass looks like. It's a perennial grass. So you only have to plant it once. And for a time we had 53 growers of that. And if we look at the bottom figure down there, the total protein in Indian rice grass, the total amount of essential amino acids, all those on the left there, was 42% versus 26% in wheat. Sorry to bore you with this, but this is a string of pearls, or if you wish, it's alpha-gliadin, and the subsection has gluten in it, which runs from 31 to 49. And it has proline, which you don't need because you can make it yourself, and has glutamine, which you don't need because you can make it yourself. But it's very springy. It's basically repeat sequences of the same springy stuff over and over again. So we developed another grain. I told you about it. Farmer gets 6 cents for oats. And this is, this is Timtana. That's stuff that I sucked out of the stem. Is a pasture grass. It's a standalone baking, and it's now sold in Montana and elsewhere. You can buy it on Amazon. Our second dark horse is Proteina. We renamed it because it's an oat, but it's high protein. Normal oats are 14% protein. This is as high, it's in the 20s. And a lot of people like it, and I promise you some bags of it. And if I can bring them on Wednesday, our last day of class, I will do so. By the way, that exam, if you can hand it in by Friday night, I'd appreciate it. I have 248 of them to read. So if you don't quite get it in by Friday night, I understand. But give it a shot. It's just a couple pages. So Proteina makes wonderful oatmeal, and I'll try to get you some. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you, maybe 6. And it's a beautiful crop from Montana. And they don't use any glyphosate when they grow it. Here's a third dark horse that we've developed. The Romans used to eat this stuff. They made more oil out of camelina than they did out of olives. It's a quick crop. You can grow it. And the oil you can burn in your little lamp. Remember, the Romans didn't have TV or electricity or anything. They had little lamps and they needed to see at night. It's a wonderful crop, and it's high in omega-3. And, excuse me. And the colder the night, the higher omega-3. It can't be grown in the south, but you can make peanut butter with the oil and replace the oil in peanut, which is very low in omega-3. You've already heard about omega-3s. That's near the end of a fatty acid. Count back 3 points and there's a double bond. The more wrinkles in a fatty acid, the better it flows in your brain. Yeah, IQ tests show that. Probably the ideal level of omega-6 to omega-3 is around 2 to 1, 3 to 1, somewhere there. So we were working with MIT and still are. And there are no fish in space. So where are they going to get their omega-3 to take people all the way to Mars? And they took some of our camelina up to this space station, left it for 6 months. We have it in the lab. We think we have a beautiful microgreen crop. These on the left are microgreens grown for 7 to 9 days. The beauty of these microgreens is nobody else has to touch them. You can grow them on the southern window all winter long. Maybe you live on an Indian reservation or somewhere where it's hard to get green vegetables. And you can grow these yourself. All you need is a sprinkle of few seeds onto a pie plate, and you're there. So we're looking at what we can do for the people that are disadvantaged, that can't go down to Albertsons or some store and buy fresh vegetables. But they can grow these in their window, and they don't need anybody else to harvest them. Maybe with dirty hands, they can do it all themselves. So we're looking at space. They've already had our seed in space. That's a big foot in the door. If you want to work on that project, come see me. And then we have this curve. It looks flat through the 80s, through about till 95 or so. And then it takes off. That's diabetes type 2 in this country. And it's another pandemic. And these are the places where it's worse. And what can we do about diabetics? One is that all those indigenous crops like camelina, tintana, and so on are good for diabetics. They don't give you a rapid sugar release, but we have been breeding crops for yield. Now, it takes 6 times as much cellular energy to make a protein as it does to make starch. A gram of protein versus a gram of starch. So we're basically breeding yield into our crops. That could have a lot to do with diabetics. The people who are poorest tend to buy the cheapest food. These are potatoes. We'll talk about them on Wednesday. And we're selecting for potatoes. There's a certain potato developed in the Andes that was specifically fed to people with diabetes type symptoms. And it was low glycemic. It didn't give them a sugar rush, which is what diabetes seems to be all about. So let's look at disadvantaged people, not just young people, but anybody disadvantaged without enough money to buy what they would consider nutritious. And you can look at zinc down there. The interesting thing about zinc is it only takes about $1 an acre to provide a zinc seed treatment. And zinc is all about DNA. To turn DNA on and off, you need a protein with a zinc finger. If you don't have enough zinc in your body, you can't turn your DNA on and off as well enough. It's found in over 100 enzymes. It's really important. And they found when they fed zinc to prisoners, most of them got over their assaultive 78% got over their assaultive behavior. And zinc is very deficient in parts of Africa where we have worked. So this is one of my real heroes. He was a teacher in Germany. He was a chemist. And he enjoyed his students, so he left his keys in the door of the lab when he went home. And the students would come in after hours and work on their own projects. And one thing about this university is that they are trying to emphasize research, and that when you graduate, you have to have some kind of research project under your belt. I don't know how successful, but they're trying to do that, and I think it's the right approach. Students should work on their own ideas and their own things. So this guy was hired by England, even though he was a German. They brought him over to say, if we want fertilizer, what do we want in it? Just fly ash from the fireplace that you burned wood? And he showed that there was a law of the limit. Find out what's limiting. And that has been guiding our research all along on nutrition. We need protein, we need lysine, methionine, omega-3, and so on. We need zinc. So be aware of the limiting factor, because that's the easiest one and most cost-effective to fix. So there was a guy, Chomek, and he treated a field like it was the atomic table. He went out and sprinkled various things on the field in Turkey to see what was limiting. And when he sprinkled zinc, he got that growth. So the beauty of that is that if you treat your field with zinc, you don't even have to do a whole lot of talking to people and convincing them to eat zinc. Even though they're stunted, even though they have abnormal behavior because they can't control their DNA, you simply say, look, you want more yield? Do zinc. And then the people and the animals that eat those crops, they get more crops. So 50% of the arable soils in Turkey and also in Afghanistan, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Kyrgyzstan, Syria, Israel, all those places are low in zinc. Okay, so the thing that we associate with those cultures is violence, and maybe zinc would help. And by the way, the pennies in your pocket are 98% zinc, even though we think they're copper. So a seed, to understand nature, understand the requirements of a seed, because we eat a lot of seeds. Man's priorities are, they want a large seed, easy to harvest, with digestible protein and essential amino acids and no toxins, soluble polymers, and basically what we think of as a good seed. Plants have a totally different priority. They can't have small molecules. There's something called colligative properties. Small molecules suck all the water out of the embryo and the seed dies. So they have to tie up their zinc, iron, all these things. They have to make large molecules, not small molecules. And feeding animals was never on the list for zinc. So we sat down with a molecular biologist who used to play baseball for the Chicago Cubs, and then he went to UC Berkeley and got a degree in protein nutrition. And we designed and made what we consider a super protein. There's Jesse on the left. You might like my green pants. And we made this super protein because we thought none of the protein in the world is any good. And we thought we could beat mother's milk. So here's the protein we made. We made it from scratch in 1984, before the word GMO was even a word. If you look at mother's milk, that's lactalbumin. What's a protein in there? And it's highly evolved to feed babies. The lysine is 9.1 versus barley and wheat and corn down about 1/3 of that. Look at our super protein. It adds up to 68 of essential amino acids. And we made it and nobody wants it. The big food industry is perfectly happy with what they do. We're only 30 or 40 years ahead of the wave of synthetic biology. It's coming. Right now you can eat plant-associated, plant-sourced protein at McDonald's. Just you wait. You watch in the next 10 years. We're going to be making super protein because we have a world to feed. And people like me that have been lucky enough to travel have seen enough starving kids. Here's the problem. You make a high nutritious plant and humans can't taste the difference. But insects, nematodes, antelope, and rats can all taste the difference. And in Egypt, we planted our high lysine wheat along with 200 other lines of wheat. And guess what happened? The rats came out and ate our 4 replications of high lysine wheat. Rats can taste, animals can taste. And so you're breeding constantly. Higher yield, you want lower nutrition. And that's just exact opposite to what we really want. You can read that paper, and I can give it to you, or you can look it up, Morrison Sands, Nature Biotech, The Breeder's Dilemma. It's pretty well read right now. So we grew some high lysine wheat, and we grew what we call a wild type, a normal wheat on the right. And then we looked at insect predation, and it went from 5% in wild type, these were basically grasshoppers, to over 50% in our EM1 line. The EM1 line is now the one we're growing in Arizona because 5 companies want it for the organic market. Wish us luck. This is Fatima. In Egypt, they eat meat maybe once a month. And they make baladi bread, which I told you about. And you can see her cooking on that flat bread there. And they buy the cheapest wheat in the world. And they get cheap food. But if you look at these 2 technicians, you'll see that they're fed the same, except the one on the left is fed lysine. And you can see von Liebig's, that German chemist, you can see the difference. And this was an experiment done 107 years ago or so, 106 years ago, published. And when you feed wheat rats gliadin protein. Rats don't grow. You give them lysine plus gliadin, they grow. You take the lysine away, and so on. You can see the limiting factor, lysine. This is a pine bark beetle. She's a very beautiful girl. She is wiping out our pine forests in the west. And she has hairy armpits. And when you look closely, you realize the armpits hairs are a fungus, a particular fungus. And when she burrows into a tree, she makes a gallery, as you can see in the lower right. And the fungus in her armpits starts growing in the tree. And then her larvae eat the fungus. And a freshman student of ours said, well, that's because maybe there's a perfect nutritional protein in that fungus. So learn from nature. Nature solves problems, and they've had millions of years to do it. So there's your super protein. That's what we want. We're hoping some computer scientists will help us design a super protein. But we need a cheap assay. So this is a cheap assay. That's a bacterial plate. Bacteria spread throughout it. But these bacteria need lysine. And you can see that we can quickly look at seed and determine the genetics and which ones to breed. This is our first high lysine wheat. What is that, about 30 years ago? Nobody wanted it. But you can make bread with it. And the bread will be higher in nutrition. This is our high lysine bacterium here, put in bread, and we've made 600,000 loaves a day for 6 months per day. And the people in Egypt preferred the taste of that sourdough bacterium. So what's new? Everything. Computers are new. Their effect on everything. We now, 23andMe, the gene thing, couldn't have been done without computers. The question is, will we listen? It's a simple problem of science not being listened to. Okay? We listen to TV ads all the time. We eat Pringles. We eat food like that. There's a lot of profit in them. But remember, the breeder's dilemma, yield versus nutrition. Fortunately, we have chemists. They can tell you if there's glyphosate in your food. They can tell you what exactly is in your food. Please remember that you're all a little bit different. Breeders now can target and follow desirable genes. Good luck. And if you have diabetes or you know somebody in your family who's celiac or diabetic, we can do things about it. It costs $19,000 a year to treat somebody with diabetes. That's a huge amount. That's our medical system. So this is almost the last slide. Please look beyond the wave that you're riding, whatever that wave is. All surfers know that you want to keep one eye out for the future wave. See it out there? And then watch out for sharks. Who are the sharks? big companies that have a vested interest in making money the good old way. And those are the sharks. They'll buy your invention and bury it. So you have to be doing this for another reason than money. And these are some of the people that work with us. And they're all brilliant. And they all understand this stuff. And at least one of them now has COVID. And we're worried about pandemics. And please be careful. What can I say? Thank you.